Well, welcome to Chapter 11 here. We've finished off killing people with Chapter 10, which is about homicides. We're moving now into the very broad category of assaults. This is among the most numerous of crimes that we're going to see in North Carolina. So there's quite a few. I'm going to limit somewhat the supplemental material that we typically can have here simply because we would just be buried with all the different assaults. But we'll mention certainly the major assaults we'll talk about. We'll also, maybe for color and to make it a little more interesting, talk about a few of the unusual assaults. But we're going to jump in with assaults, batteries, which is somewhat of a dated term in North Carolina, and other crimes against the persons. Now, of course, obviously, we've got those learning objectives that we post for each chapter. Not particularly important for us to look at this moment. All right, let's talk about the crime of assault and the crime of battery. Now, part of the problem here in discussing this is that different jurisdictions, and North Carolina is a good example of this, will use terminology different than other jurisdictions. So at first, we're going to talk about how the term assault and the term battery really emerged in the common law. So the way I like to teach this is that A is followed by B. Assault begins it, battery completes it. So what's an assault? An assault is when you take some action, if you're the one committing the assault, that would cause a reasonable person to fear that they're about to be hit or hurt, or that a weapon is going to be used against them. So you cock back your fist and you aim it at someone's nose. That person has a reasonable fear that they're going to get hit in the nose. However, if you're doing, say, a stage play or a movie, you can draw a gun, you can pull back to hit someone, but obviously it's a play. You're not really doing it. The same thing is true of kidding around or horsing around. So an assault is not always any time someone threatens to hit someone. They have to make this threat. This threat has to be believable. The reasonable person has to believe it. The so-called reasonable man. The battery, remember A is followed by B, is the completion of this. This is when I've cocked back my fist, my arm, and I'm getting ready to hit you in the nose. That's the assault. The battery is when I actually hit you in the nose. Now, I don't want you to walk away from this very simple introduction thinking, well, there's got to be a hit. It can be something that is not painful. Maybe it is socially degrading. Suppose I spit at you. Okay, if I hock back, it's an old term, okay, like I'm going to spit at you, you can argue that's an assault. If and the saliva hits you, that's the battery. Now, you're not bleeding. It's not serious. It's degrading. It's inappropriate. But it's also a battery. It's when the assault is complete. You intentionally inflict either bodily harm, I punch you in the nose, or an unlawful touching in a rude or offensive manner. Now, you can see how this could also have a sexual component. So if I go to grab a woman's breasts, or if I go to slap someone on the buttocks, or if I go to grab their genitalia, as I reach for them, that is the assault. If I actually make contact with them, that becomes the battery. Now, we're talking about in an offensive manner. If this is a consensual relationship, it's not going to be a battery nor an assault. But if without invitation, without consent, I make contact with private parts of your body, that can be and is rude and offensive, and that can be the battery. Now, a term that's used, not completely in North Carolina, sometimes we tend to be a little bit more specific, is what happens when you're using a deadly weapon. So, classic example here would be a firearm. If I shoot you with a gun, okay, and the gun hits you, that's assault with a deadly weapon inflicting serious injury. That's a very serious charge. We're looking at multiple years in prison there. If you use a deadly weapon in many jurisdictions, we call this an aggravated assault. And in almost every jurisdiction I can think of, if you use a deadly weapon in your assault and your battery, if it's completed, it's going to be a felony. It's not going to be a slap on the wrist. It's not going to be a little bit of time in jail. It's going to be multiple years in prison. So let's look at North Carolina. So North Carolina, excuse me. Here are the definition of assaults. Now, North Carolina has, as I said, lots and lots and lots of assaults. Here are just a few of them. We have, of course, North Carolina General Statute 1433A says an unlawful touching, okay, or application of force to the body of another person. So it never includes touching yourself or touching an animal, touching a building, touching an inanimate object. And here are some of the classic ones we see in North Carolina. Simple assault, which is typically a misdemeanor. That would be, say, you slap someone, you punch someone in the shoulder. Then assault on a female. That's going to be one where obviously, most of the time, many states have this, and many states will say it has to be a male that commits the assault on the female. Assault inflicting serious injury, just what it sounds like. Assault with a deadly weapon, again, just what it sounds like. Assault with a deadly weapon with the intent to kill or to inflict serious bodily injury. And that's about as serious as we get. It's essentially an attempted homicide. It's just one step down. So attempted assaults. Essentially, North Carolina does not use the term battery. Remember, I said in the common law, the assault is the threat and the battery is the complete. What we have done is, in most crimes, there's still a few crimes in North Carolina where we use battery, but most of the time we've dropped it out of our lexicon. And instead, we call the completed contact an assault and the attempted contact attempted assault. So as opposed to having two separate words, assault and then battery, we have attempted assault and then we have assault. So that can be confusing for students, but just to clarify it. In North Carolina, attempted assault is to put someone in fear of an offensive contact, what in the common law is usually just called assault. And when you actually hit them or have this unlawful contact in a rude and offensive manner, or when you hit them, squeeze them, punch them, shoot them, okay, under the common law that's battery, but in North Carolina we call it assault. If the act results in a physical contact, we call it complete or assault. Usually, attempted assaults are punished at lower levels, and usually, most of the time, an attempted assault is a misdemeanor in North Carolina. Okay, so under the classic laws, the definition of assault, the victim has to be aware of the threat or danger or overt act. If I'm coming up behind someone, I'm going to hit them, and I change my mind, there's really been no, in North Carolina, attempted assault or under the common law, an assault. In many states, if they are aware of it, it's attempted assault. You do not have to show you are aware that you're going to harm someone, just that they were placed in reasonable fear and were aware. So even if you weren't going to do it. So that's a little complex, and I don't think it's terribly, terribly important to us. Let's look at, remember I said that North Carolina uses North Carolina General Statute 14-33. Let's take a look at that statute. So 1433 is the unification of the terms assault and battery. It doesn't define it, because what North Carolina does is it gives, it says assault, but it's going to let all those different possible scenarios play out and be defined in case law. So the courts can determine what is or is not an assault. So here would be a question you might have. Let's suppose I hit you 1, 2, 3 times in the chest, or once in the head and twice in the chest. Is that one assault, or since there were 3 separate offensive contacts, is that 3 separate assaults? What the North Carolina courts have said is if it's part of one, usually you'll hear the term in North Carolina when they talk about this of criminal nexus. If single event, if it's one single event, one fight, it's one assault. Now, if I punch you in the chest, go home, have a sandwich, come back, punch you in the chest again, that's going to be 2 assaults. Simple assault in North Carolina is a class 2 misdemeanor. It doesn't, there is potentially less of a penalty, but it doesn't get much less serious than a simple assault in North Carolina. We're only talking days at most in jail. We're not talking any substantial prison. But it starts to escalate when we go to the aggravated assaults. Excuse me. This is simple assaults. Let's go to aggravated. So aggravated assaults, and North Carolina give these different terms. We'll see those in a minute. Basically, these are the step up. When we say, okay, it's no longer just you punch someone in the chest. Now you're doing something else. Now, in some states, assault's broken down into degrees. So you have 1st degree, 2nd degree, 3rd degree. North Carolina doesn't tend to use that. In some states, there are separate crimes for assault with deadly weapons. Now, we usually do that in North Carolina. Assaults become aggravated or more serious, for example, when they are committed with a firearm, which is a deadly weapon. Remember, I showed you that assault with a deadly weapon is a separate crime in North Carolina. Or if they're part of an intent to commit a felony. I take a gun, I point it at you, and I demand your wallet. That is a assault, attempted assault, right? And also a robbery. And since you're using a deadly weapon, of course, it's going to be a felony in North Carolina. All right, so categories of assaults in North Carolina. Some of them are based upon the injuries we see. Is it a serious injury? Is it a deadly injury? Was it an injury against a minor? Some are based upon what objects were used in the assaults. And like I said, I could give you a big, long list of all the different assaults, but I'm not going to do that. I think it's needlessly confusing. Sometimes we look at, did you use something? Did you use a gun? Did you use a knife? Did you use a 2x4? Sometimes we look at who is suffering. So in North Carolina, we might have assault on a minor. We might have assault on an EMS technician or an assault on a police officer. Sometimes we look at it and make it more serious if it is part of a pattern. Is it a habitual action, which usually calls for a longer sentence? Is the assault based on some prejudice, some ethnic, racial, or religious hatred? It has to be something based on it. It wouldn't make it more serious if you just hated people that went to NC State or Duke or Chapel Hill. But it would make it more serious if you hated someone because they were an ethnic group like Chinese, or a racial group like black, or a religious group like Jew. All right, now as we said, battery is that kind of completed. And almost any contact can be a battery, so long as, and here's the first important point, it's non-consensual and it's in a hostile or belligerent manner. If I'm walking in the hallway and I bump into you, and I might even hurt you with my, I might be carrying an object, and then you stop short and I bump into you. That's a contact. You may not want it, but it's something that kind of comes with the everyday of being out in the real world. Now, some states make it a battery to touch another offensively, even if there's no bodily injury. And certainly, I want to kind of use the term embarrassment here. Let's take a man and a woman. If I'm walking in the hallway and she stops short and I bump into her and I touch her breasts, that's not going to be an assault. Now, she may be offended that I touched her breast, but I might have had my hands up and she stopped short and she was, not paying attention. On the other hand, notice that it doesn't require, if I do this intentionally, that there's a bodily injury. walking in the hallway again. I come up to her and I just, out of the blue, grab her breasts and squeeze. That is offensive. She is not harmed in the sense that the skin is broken, there's a bruise, there's bleeding, but it's offensive. You have the right to your own personhood. Serious bodily injury usually is called the aggravated battery. Sometimes the circumstances of the victim, for example, if you assault someone who's pregnant, or the identity of the victim, like you are a woman or a child. Let's look at some of North Carolina's assaults, the felonies and the misdemeanors. So you'll notice after most of these, I put a little F or M. The last couple I didn't, and I guess I should go back and change those. Assault inflicting serious injury can be a misdemeanor. Assault inflicting serious bodily injury can be a felony. Assault inflicting injury by strangulation, felony. Assault with a deadly weapon can be a misdemeanor. That can be, if you did it with the intent to kill, it can be a felony. And assault with a deadly weapon inflicting serious injury can be a felony. Assault with a deadly weapon with the intent to kill causing serious injury, felony. And then we've simply got assault by pointing a gun, which can be a misdemeanor. Now, like I say, can be because these can be very close. Typically what will happen is the prosecution will pick out that assault, which it deems to be the most serious, in order to, when it negotiates a plea bargain, in most cases are negotiated as a plea bargain, it can plead down to the most serious or longest charge they can. All right, so what are the defenses to these charges? One, here's a big one, and this will include defenses to other crimes, but these are common defenses for committing some act of violence or unwarranted touching or offensive touching. One, self-defense. Someone is coming at you and they're swinging a club. It's self-defense to hit them first. Someone is coming up, even if it's an offensive touching, someone is coming up to grab your buttocks. And you don't want to, so you slap that person's hand away. The conduct must be necessary and lawful to prevent escape, to accomplish a lawful arrest or detention. Okay? Now, if someone's trying to get away from a police officer, the police officer has the right to use violence and force, and he can't be charged with an assault because it's necessary to either prevent the escape of the individual he has in custody, or to arrest the person he's taking into custody, or to maintain that person in detention. The next one is kind of self-evident, but if you think about two boxers in a ring, they're each trying to hit each other in the most offensive manner, knock each other out, literally. But they have both consented to this. So when you consent within the rules of a sport being played, you can't claim assault. Now notice within the rules. So let's suppose that we're boxing, the bell rings, I turn around, and you cold cock me. You hit me in the back of the head as hard as you can, and you knock me down. That's outside the rules of boxing. You can't hit someone after the bell. You can't hit them like that. That would become an assault. You could charge a boxer with that crime. What about what a parent can do to a child? If a person is the parent or the guardian or is standing in the place of the parent in loco parentis, okay, they may use force against the child for discipline. Now, it can't be that I just want to hit the kid. It's a Tuesday morning and I'm in a bad mood and I want to hit this child. That's not good enough. The kid's about to put his hand on a hot stove. Can I slap the hand away? I can. The kid ran into the street. Can I spank the kid? I can. But it's got to be reasonable. Kid runs into the street. Can I cut off the kid's leg? No. Kid's about to touch a hot stove. Can I break the kid's fingers one at a time to teach him a lesson? No. It's also a defense if the offensive touching was accidental or was consented to or was necessary under the circumstances. So let's suppose that you have a phobia about having your hair touched. You find that very offensive. But you're dangling off a cliff, and the only way that I can grab you before you fall, okay, is to grab you by the hair of your head and pull you up. You might say, well, that's really offensive to me. In my culture, no one's allowed to touch your hair. Well, I'm sorry. It was necessary in the circumstances. It's a defense. Obviously, also, consent, like we talked about the boxers, or accidental bumping into people in the hallway. Okay. Now, offensive touching, but remember this, and we'll leave this before we make it a little bit more confusing to you. Remember that it doesn't really require broken skin, broken bones, bruising, bleeding, cutting. The injury doesn't have to involve trauma. You have a right to personal bodily autonomy. You have the right to have this space around you into which others can only enter if you invite them. Now, different states can have different levels, and they can have specific crimes. But if you think about something like, it's not truly an assault, but you think about something like stalking, you're not physically harming that person, but you're psychologically terrorizing them. If you think about, again, if I spit in your face, you're not physically harmed, but that's offensive. So that would be an offensive touching. Now, one of the things I said, moving on here before I flip the next slide, is that North Carolina doesn't use the term battery much. Okay? Unfortunately, for those of us studying in North Carolina, we have kept battery around in a few places. And part of this is, and I think this is a good illustration of the law in North Carolina, is nobody sat down on a Wednesday in 2010 and drafted the entire criminal statutes of North Carolina. Instead, they grew up piecemeal. We took a little bit here, a little bit there. This law developed in the 1790s. This one was the 1830s. This one was the 1880s. This was the 1950s. This is the 20s and 2020s. Law develops gradually. Law gets interpreted gradually. So there's always going to be, unless someone has gone in and completely revised the criminal code, there's always going to be bits and pieces left. And one of the things that's going to term is left is North Carolina is going to keep battery around in one place or another. Here's the place that you're going to see it. Sexual battery. North Carolina General Statute 1427.33. Now this is a misdemeanor, but it's the most serious misdemeanor. Now misdemeanors in North Carolina fall into A1, Class 1, Class 2. Class 3 arguably, but A1 is the most serious one you can have. And this is any sexual contact forcibly against the will of another party, if it's for the purposes of sexual arousal, sexual abuse, or sexual gratification. Now, this can become a felony. If the person cannot give consent, this could be a rape. If someone is mentally disabled, incapacitated, or physically helpless, if they're under the age of 12, it can be an aggravated sex crime, and we can bump this up to 25 years in prison. But let's go back to the example of I come up to a woman, or I guess anyone comes up to a woman, and without her consent, grabs her breasts, slaps her buttocks, that's a little bit closer, or grabs at her genitalia. Again, if I'm doing this, for whatever reason, in a play or something where it was consensual, or a movie and we were filming a scene, there's a defense there. But if I'm just doing it because I'm sexually aroused, or I want to abuse her, or I'm just seeking sexual gratification by doing it, it's sexual battery in North Carolina. Okay, moving on. In some things like sports, we have consent. And the classic example here is boxing, but a hard tackle in football, a blow to the jaw in boxing are within the rules. Okay. And this is called the voluntary participant rule. If you step into the ring of a boxing match, you're there. But if you go beyond the rules of the game, now, can you swing a piece of wood and hit an object? Yeah, you can. You can play baseball. But let's suppose someone throws a baseball and you don't like it. You thought they were trying to brush you off the plate. And for those who don't play baseball, what can happen is the pitcher can be upset and want to back the player off the plate, and he'll throw usually a fastball fairly close to the player. Now, sometimes he'll hit the player doing this. And you can argue that, you're not allowed to hit the player. That's pretty close to being a violation of the rules, although very hard to prove that he intentionally hit him. But what will happen there is sometimes the player will charge the mound. He'll take the bat and maybe throw it at the pitcher and run at him. That would be outside the rules of the game. And there could be criminal charges. Now, forget about the players for a second. What about the rest of us in the stands? Well, these are problems. So you can have spectator violence or parental rage, and we have specific statutes in North Carolina that make these criminal acts and separate criminal acts. Now, other physical contact without consent. Pushing, pinching, biting, scratching, touching, kissing, punching, spitting, and tackling can be done in a friendly manner. It can be done jokingly or in a loving manner, or the contact can be hostile, angry, or belligerent. So we can draw a line there. All those things, scratching, touching, kissing, etc., are contact. The question is it offensive contact? If it's not intentional, okay, you've got a defense. If the contact was intentional and it's done without permission, then it can be criminal. If it's shown that the contact provoked or tended to provoke a disturbance or disorder, the offender could be charged with disorderly conduct. If you did this to pick a fight, you can be charged with usually a separate crime, making it worse. As I said, most states have enacted things like aggravated assault, or, if they don't use the term aggravated assault, aggravated battery, which usually will increase it from a misdemeanor to a felony. So, aggravated assault, use of a firearm in intent to commit a felony, battery, serious bodily harm, and use of it. So, did you use it? Did you intend to hurt? That's going to be your assault. Did you actually hurt him with the gun? That's going to be your battery. Again, in North Carolina, not usually. Here's some North Carolina law to make that a little clearer. North Carolina creates separate assaults and penalties if the injured party uses a specific method, or if you injure a specific bodily part. And we're going to look at each of these in a minute, but just hold on. So we're going to look, were you cut? Were you stabbed? Were you hit in the head? Did you lose a tooth? Did you lose an eye? Were you bruised? Also remember that there's both the physical injury one can see, and then there's the mental trauma that can attach to it. If someone is raped, okay, yes, there's a physical injury that occurs, but there's also a psychological trauma associated with the violence of a sexual assault. And this can be pretty critical. So the level of this is something we examine. And this is why it's hard to define assault. So this is not a bad slide. We really need to have a lens to look at all these separate possible permutations or possible ways in which an assault can occur. You can't make an overall law that covers absolutely everything in absolute specific detail, because there's going to be almost infinite combinations. So we need to be able to distinguish between a misdemeanor child abuse, striking a child with an open hand, and a felony child abuse, striking him with a strap or an object. All right, so what are deadly weapons in North Carolina? Because I kind of referred to those a few times. All right, well, most of the time, deadly weapon, you're thinking gun. And it's certainly true that every firearm is a per se or is automatically a deadly weapon. But what about other objects? Well, you know, a 2x4 is just a 2x4. A piece of wood is just a piece of wood until you use it as a weapon. So having a chair in your house doesn't mean you have a deadly weapon. Swinging a chair at someone could be using a deadly weapon. So what's a deadly weapon? A deadly weapon is anything that's capable of inflicting serious bodily injury, really in the circumstances you're thinking of. So a gun is always a deadly weapon. A knife is almost always a deadly weapon. But, and we're assuming they're being used in a crime there. But, you know, a bottle? No. A pen? No. But if you've ever seen Joe Pesci in Casino, you know that a pen can be a deadly weapon. All right, mayhem and malicious disfigurement. And we'll look at some of these in North Carolina. But menacing laws are typically defined as intentionally placing or attempting to place someone in immediate fear of physical injury, and they exist in some states. North Carolina doesn't use them. We have communicating a threat. We have a few other things. Mayhem and malicious disfigurement, now we have some very specific laws there, is the willful infliction of injury on another so as to cripple or mutilate them. So we have, for example, the maiming of the eye, ear, nose, or tongue in North Carolina. We'll look at that in 1 second. And technically, I guess that's a mayhem statute. Others do not include it as a separate crime, but make it a more serious offense. You have to have the intent to maim. So if I punch you in the face, that's one crime. But if I'm punching you in the face to put out your eye, that makes it a much more serious crime. And if I just did it negligently, usually that's not going to be enough. So let's look at North Carolina mayhem statutes. The first thing is we focus on, is it malicious, which means in North Carolina, ill will or hatred, and or is it intentional? Then we look at, what were you trying to hurt? Were you trying to take out an eye? Were you trying to damage their hearing or their ear? Were you trying to remove their tongue? Were you trying to castrate them? Were you trying to remove a limb or even a hand or a finger? All of those will make it worse. Also, sometimes we have in North Carolina, you used a particular methodology. So if you threw sulfuric acid on someone, a few years back there was several cases of, not so much in the United States, but in certain countries where they were throwing acid at people, mainly women, who were seen to be acting outside the scope of acceptable behavior. And acid obviously can burn and disfigure people. That's a specific crime in North Carolina. That's assault using an acid or an alkali, because you have a pH scale. Acid is on 1, so sulfuric acid is very bad. It'll hurt you and disfigure you. But alkali, which is a base, do essentially the same thing. It'll interact and it will disfigure and maim you. So that'd be something like throwing lye on someone. Lye, L-Y-E there. All right, hate crimes. Now, you know, sometimes I get pushback about this in class. Sometimes students will say, well, you know, why are we trying to be so politically correct that we're looking at why people do things? To which our reply is, we're always been concerned with why people do things. Did you do it intentionally? That's why you did it. Did you do it to hurt that person? That's why you do it. Now, obviously, hate crimes can take a little bit further. States may enact hate crime laws that enhance or increase penalties if you intentionally select a victim. So, for example, assault on a female. You can make it worse if you are attacking a woman. So, if you select a person because of their race, their religion, their color, if they're disabled, their sexual orientation, their national origin, or their ancestry. All of those can be a hate crime in certain states. And what they usually will do is increase the penalty. Now, you have to prove that, if a white person hits a black person or a black person hits a white person, it might just be they had a fight over a parking spot, right? That doesn't make it a hate crime. But if, someone's walking down the street and they're wearing KKK robes and they're looking for someone to beat up and they see a black guy and they jump him and they beat him, well, then the method, the motivation there is the intentional selection of someone based on race. All right, so ethnic intimidation. This is a shot of the KKK. I picked, this is actually a northern shot. This is, I believe, out of Muncie, Indiana, if I'm not mistaken. And one of the things that, as I teach my class about this, is don't ever think that racial prejudice is something, including the Klan, that was limited to the American South. Among the most powerful sections and parts of the Klan in the 20th century existed in the North. In fact, the state of Indiana largely fell under the control of the Ku Klux Klan during the 1920s. So North Carolina does have a statute, North Carolina 14401.14, that ups the ante. If you commit an assault, you assault another, or you damage their property, or you threaten to do so because of someone's race, because of someone's color, because of someone's religion or nationality. Now, North Carolina chose those 4 categories, right? You'll notice there's things missing from that. It doesn't say gender, right? It doesn't say sexual orientation. It doesn't say economic class. So states are free to select which classes they're going to protect. And what it does is it raises it usually from a class 2 misdemeanor to a class 1. If you teach others to do so, and here you're getting into a potential constitutional issue, it can be a class 1 misdemeanor. All right, we briefly kind of mentioned children and all this. Let's talk about child abuse and child neglect. The United States Department of Health and Human Services report that the United States has the worst child abuse record of any industrialized nation. It's pretty high. So up to 5 children a day are killed because of child abuse, child neglect in the United States, and hundreds are injured. And these are just the ones we know about. People who inflict injuries on children, obviously if you kill a child, we can charge you with a homicide. We could charge you if you harm them with assault and battery, with assault with a dangerous weapon, with an aggravated battery, or anything that's in the statute. But one of the things that we've done, really in the last 100-odd years, is that we've carved out special laws for child abuse, particularly abuse and neglect. The key term is neglect there. Most of the crimes we talk about are active crimes. You punch someone, you kick someone, you spit on someone, you grab someone, you stab someone. That's an action. But sometimes you fail to do things. So usually that's not a crime. Let's suppose I'm walking down the street and I see someone being attacked by another person. And I say, wow, that's too bad, and I just go about my way. That's not a crime. I don't have to jump in there and defend. I'm not Superman, right? But, so a duty is not imposed upon you. However, for children, that can be different. Did I not give adequate care to a child? Did I not feed them? Did I not take them for medical care? I did not provide a safe environment? That is child neglect, and that is a crime. If I don't provide a safe environment for my neighbor, it's not a crime, because I don't have a responsibility to him under the law. It's also a crime to expose a child to sexually harmful material, to involve a child in sexual activities, or contribute to the delinquency of a child, which is a loaded question. Most states have a duty to report if an individual charged with the responsibility suspects abuse or neglect. Now, most child abuse reports are reported through the public schools. So what happens is little Jack or little Jane go to school, and the teacher, Miss McGillicuddy or whatever her name is, notices that there are bruises or cuts or abrasions that are not natural, and she then has a duty to report that to the proper authorities. All right, let's move on to another crime. Let's move on to kidnapping. And again, we'll focus on North Carolina's in a minute, but kidnapping was not a very frequently charged crime in the common law, but it became much more serious in the United States. We began to use a word that most people are unfamiliar with. American statutes broadened the scope of what kidnapping was, and they kind of introduced a term, and it's called asportation. Asportation. Asportation is to physically remove someone from one place to another against their will. And that is really required in order for us to have a kidnapping in many states. Now, there can be exceptions. Most states require that the victim be moved. Now, it doesn't have to be substantial. It can be a very short distance. Not moving from one room to another, that's not a kidnapping. But if you took someone out of your house, their house on, 1 Main Street, and you took them up to 10 Main Street, 4 or 5 houses away, yeah, that's going to be a kidnapping. Is there an attempt to constrain the victim against their will? Then pretty much any movement's going to be enough. So kidnapping kind of gets applied a little bit more than you think. Let's look at North Carolina's charges for kidnapping. There's 2 basic ones. And one of the things that we do in North Carolina is, if you look at the North Carolina kidnapping statute, first-degree kidnapping and second-degree kidnapping, they're identical with one exception. Kidnapping is one of those crimes that obviously people are kind of thinking about that, because it's not a process that occurs like that. It's a process that, okay, I'm going to have to take this person. I'm going to take this person here. Maybe I'm going to write a ransom note. Maybe I'm going to hold them for a while. You're really thinking about this. This is a premeditated act. So since that has creeped in, what we want to do is we want to give that kidnapper an incentive not to harm the person. So what we do with our kidnapping statute in North Carolina is we say, look, you're going to get charged with kidnapping if you grab this person. But don't make it worse by sexually assaulting them, by injuring them, or harming them. If you do that, it's going to be a first-degree kidnapping. You're looking at a lot more time in prison. But if you release them in a safe location, if you don't sexually assault them, if you don't sexually injure them, if you don't harm them at all, it's a second-degree kidnapping. Still a crime. We're not going to let you go just because you didn't hurt them, but less of a crime. One of the things that can happen is sometimes you can have kidnapping being applied to underlying charges. Now, sometimes if the whole crime's kidnapping, it's not a big issue, but there can be other crimes. Here's an example. In North Carolina, let's suppose you go in and you're robbing a bank, and you order the clerks to go from the front of the bank to the safe. You're going to leave them in there. Well, were they moved against their will? They were. Is that going to be enough to have a bank robbery turn into a kidnapping? The answer is no. But in North Carolina, let's suppose you took that clerk at the front of the bank, and you said, well, I think SWAT's out there, and I'm going to use this clerk as a shield so I don't get shot. And you use them as a shield when you go to your car. against their will, you're dragging them, you're moving them, you're threatening to hurt them. That would be a kidnapping in North Carolina. Also, if the movement increases the risk to the victim, it can be enough. So if you were to commit a rape in a public park at night, and then you say, well, I don't want the rape victim to turn me in right away. So I'm going to move them to a place that's not visible from the road. I'm going to tie them up, and I'm going to leave them down in a gully. So I'll tie them up and I'll move them down there. That could be a kidnapping. Now, we can also have kidnapping by confinement. And this is an alternative to the asportation. Like I said, we'll look at North Carolina's in a second, but this is just kind of the general. Confinement means you place someone in a location or place of isolation where others can't easily reach the victim. And pretty much any place can meet this, including a closet in your own home. It does need to be for a substantial period of time, and this can vary depending upon how long it is. All right, so as I said, North Carolina's got a couple here. Here are our North Carolina options. We've got the first degree and second degree kidnapping. I already kind of talked about that. We then have felonious restraint, where you restrain someone and transport them. And you can see how that almost becomes a kidnapping. Then we've got false imprisonment. So here, you don't have that asportation element. You restrain someone without cause or lawfully, and you detain them. Then we've got abduction of a child, kind of self-explanatory. And then you've got at least two charges in North Carolina, although they both fall under human trafficking. Holding someone in involuntary servitude, basically making them work for you as a slave, or holding someone in sexual servitude, basically holding someone against their will and having sexual relations or letting others have sexual relations. Hostage taking. Kidnapping typically requires this asportation, some distance or a substantial difference. And hostage taking does require that you're held against your will, and the purpose is to get another person to perform some act like paying a ransom. So if I go into your house and you're married to the president of the local bank and I take you hostage, okay, this could be a kidnapping charge if I call your husband up and say, I've got your wife at home. If you don't bring home $1 million from the bank, I'm going to hurt her or you'll never see her again. False imprisonment, again, this is one we see in North Carolina. False imprisonment is a separate charge from kidnapping. And basically, you are confining someone or restraining someone's liberty, and that is intentional and without consent. So it's not, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, I locked you in this room by accident. It's, I locked you in this room, you didn't consent to me locked in the room, I wouldn't let you out. And I have no lawful authority to do that. If I'm a owner of a store and I catch a I catch a store robber in the store and I lock him in this storage room until the police arrive, it's not false imprisonment. But if I get mad at someone in the store, a clerk, and I don't like the way you're talking to me, I'm your boss, and I locked them in the storage room for a while. You can just cool off in there. It's a false imprisonment charge. Now, very, very brief detentions. If a teacher detains a child, if someone detains a shoplifter, they're usually not false imprisonments. All right, parental kidnapping. It would be really nice to think that parents are always the good guys, but they're not. Most of the incidences that you're going to see of a child being abducted or taken are not going to be a stranger doing it. They're going to be a non-custodial parent or someone who's standing in the place of the parent doing it. So strangers aren't the only ones who kidnap children. Very often parents, sometimes grandparents, will kidnap their child or abduct their child. Thousands of children a year suffer from this. And sometimes the motivation is very pure. Sometimes people say, well, look, yes, I didn't have custody of the child, but the mother or the father that did have custody was beating the child or starving the child, therefore I took the child in. Most states will extradite an offending parent back to the state in which the offense was committed if he or she can be located. And that can be a serious issue, whether you can find them. This is all those milk cartons you used to see. All right, family violence. Excuse me, I jumped to. The National Institute of Mental Health concludes that physical violence occurs between family members more often than it occurs between other individuals or in any other settings except wars and riots. So one of the things I will often tell my class is the person that's most likely to harm you is the person you know, not the stranger. Family members, including spouses, people you're living with, your parents, your children, or someone you've had a child with, are the ones that are very often the ones that are most likely to hurt you. All states have not only statutes that look down to children, child abuse statutes, but North Carolina has an elder abuse statutes. So this is a failure to properly care for vulnerable adults. If you are in charge of a hospital unit and you did not take care of a patient and they were injured because of it, there's a charge there because they're vulnerable. But if it's a family member you're supposed to take care of, you have an elderly parent or grandparent living with them and you don't care for you, there can be a criminal charge. Violence in the workplace. Assault, battery, and other crimes against persons in the workplace. The U.S. Department of Justice reports that 1 million people become victims of crime, violent crime, while at work. And this can occur in schools as well. So increasingly, we're very concerned with school shootings. So obviously, these crimes can occur. All right, the last thing to talk about here as we kind of round out our hour is road rage. We spend a tremendous amount of our time in automobiles. And vehicle traffic-related injuries or death are the 9th leading cause of death in the world. And then you have to add in DUIs, driving under the influence of alcohol. And that's the leading cause of criminal homicide in the United States. Again, I tell my students, it's possible that someone's going to jump out from a bush and when they're robbing you, stab you. It's possible that someone's going to be robbing a bank and shoot you. But far more likely is you're going to be driving home, from dropping the kids off at the soccer match, and somebody's going to be drunk, and they're going to cross that yellow line, and they're going to hit you and kill you. Of all the homicides that occur in the United States, drunk driving is number 1. And obviously we have not just the homicides to deal with there, but we have injuries. So if I'm a drunk driver and I sideswipe you or run you off the road, that can be a crime. And it can be, of course, that people sometimes feel free to just act like lunatics because they're driving a car, and this is road rage. And again, some states, not North Carolina so much, have specific charges for this. All right, well, that pretty much concludes our assault statutes. And focus again on North Carolina. There'll be a few things I'll go back in and correct, but other than that, I hope you have a happy and productive day. When you're ready, we can move on to the next chapter. Have a good morning, afternoon, or evening.